How's everybody doing today? Good. So Brandy, this is supposed to be a fireside chat, so this will be our fire here today, and we're going to talk about the port. I think it's something that people don't necessarily see from time to time, though it is the lifeblood of so much that happens here in New Orleans, and there's so much that's going on with you all at the port on a daily basis. That I know that there's a lot to talk about. So let's just dive right in, okay? So, everyone's talking about supply chain issues. We talk about it all the time on Fox 8 Morning Edition, and we hear a lot about what's happening on either side of the country, especially on the West Coast. It's a log jam of ships that can't come in, of containers that can't be shipped out. How is that affecting us here in New Orleans? And just, I guess, share some of your perspective. I mean, coming from the West Coast as well, what's happening there?
Absolutely. Well, first, it's great to be here. My goodness, it's been a couple of years. It's been a whole pandemic since I've seen everyone. And wow, like you said, the world has completely changed from a supply chain in a shipping perspective. And really, it started from the beginning of the pandemic and COVID. From a shipping perspective, we're just amazed that, who ever thought you would see the picture of a container on the front of the New Yorker magazine? And now, literally splashed across, the news every day are containers and, ships. And it really did start with the pandemic. And it was kind of the beginning of what started causing the challenges in the supply chain, and part of that disruption was consumer demand, e-commerce, partly people being locked down. Now, my husband would argue that my ordering habits are solely responsible for the supply chain crisis, but I'm sure many of you experience it too, is that demand. We like to click on that button. It is definitely the consumer demand, but it's also the speed in which we expect now to get our goods. And that's not going to change. That is the way business is done now. And before, retailers and manufacturers, they were saying, you know what, I'm going to save money and I'm going to have one port, one gateway, a couple of warehouses, and I'm going to save money. And now, whether it's because of congestion or because of storms, natural disasters. You're seeing before, you may have worried about hurricanes in one area of the country. Now you're looking at freezes in Texas and tornadoes and you name it, is suppliers are realizing that they need diversification. And what you're seeing in the supply chain is the demand, and you're seeing disruption. So you have disruption partly because of COVID, with manufacturers having staffing shortages, labor shortages. That has definitely caused disruption. I think we're going to continue to see that with additional, hopefully not as severe as we've seen in the past with other COVID breakdowns, outbreaks. We're seeing that now in parts of Shanghai, in China. Unfortunately, the war in the Ukraine, that is another disruption that causes congestion in the European ports. All of that causes chaos within the port systems. They are predicting that you will see that probably through 2023. We do see that it'll loosen up a little bit because the ocean carriers are building new vessels that'll bring more capacity into the market. To your point, how does the New Orleans gateway fare into that? We're a little bit different than what you see all over the headlines. The West Coast, predominantly, that surge, that congestion you're seeing is mostly imports, a lot of it coming from Asia. That's the e-commerce, the Amazon effect is just tons of imports coming into the country. We, fortunately, have not been backlogged on the congestion side because we're pretty rare here in Louisiana, New Orleans. We're one of the rare export container ports in the country. All of the majority of other ports in the country, they've always kind of envied us because we actually are one of those rare states that produce and manufacture a lot of exports. So we haven't gotten this congestion from some of that. So some of what you're seeing on the West Coast, it's a lot of imports coming in from Asia.
Right. I think some folks would be fascinated to learn the kind of stuff that's coming in and out through here. maybe not necessarily, like you say, the Amazon packages, more of, raw material, even, fruits, vegetables, chicken, that sort of stuff that comes through that's, is stuff that we just expect. So to your point, you're saying almost there's this demand, and it's almost an artificial lack of supply because of the way that the supply chain is broken. So when we talk about the port here in New Orleans, obviously it's been affected, and people are looking for other ports to bring their goods. To your point, I know Mobile is another port that's started to see some success, and that's shipments that could be coming here to New Orleans. What can you do to try and shift those ships of the Mississippi River?
Absolutely. I think it's twofold. Kind of out of those challenges come opportunities. Is prior to COVID, I usually, your point of people don't always understand ports, I always try to equate it for the average person to an airport, because we all travel through airports. We understand that, we use them personally. Just like an airline is, when an airline decides to choose a city, one, they take their airplane to multiple airports, and they're going to call. So when they come to the Gulf, they call Houston, Mobile, and New Orleans, because if you think about it, that billion-dollar container vessel is coming from Asia. That takes at least 30 days. So they're calling multiple ports, and Houston is the biggest market. They bring in the most containers, big population, and we have to be able to, one, take the same size of vessel as Houston and Mobile, and number two, you want to be able to fill that vessel, and you want to have imports and exports, just like an airplane. You don't want to fly empty one way. You want that airplane full both directions. So for New Orleans, being an export-driven port, that's great, but you want to balance. And so one of our kind of Achilles heel in this is that we have a lot of exports. Well, we need to grow our imports, because if not, you are sitting there, you've got tons of exports to send out, and to your point, when we think about a container facility, we are sending out, mostly exports coming out of the petrochemical industry, which are plastic resins mostly, out of Baton Rouge area, and all of the agricultural, predominantly poultry, out of northern Louisiana. Well, you have to have an import coming in so that you have a container, a box, that you can put that export in. If not, you've got an imbalance, you don't have equipment. So it's important that we attract those imports. So for us, prior to COVID, we were making great strides in attracting those imports. Well, how do you do that? You do it through growing your population, or you attract those retailers and those manufacturers, your distribution centers, and we've made great strides, and really credit to our economic development and our state for attracting companies like Medline. Amazon opening up 3 million square feet in Baton Rouge, really making strides towards that. Those are import accounts, so making stride towards that. But one of the biggest challenges that we've had is infrastructure. Is at the end of the day, where Mobile had made significant progress, is that if you're a major retailer, if you're Walmart, you're Amazon, and they come to Louisiana and you can't tell them that you have a plan to be able to take the larger vessels 10 years from now, am I going to shift my entire supply chain, all of my warehouses, all of my trucking contracts, all of my labor, to a state that can't tell me I have a plan for you?
Right.
So that's, for us, for the port, that's why it's so vitally important that we have a plan that we can show to them that, yes, when Houston or Mobile can take that larger vessel, we're ready to deliver for you.
Well, let's talk about that larger vessel, because I think the elephant in the room is probably sitting a little bit over us, maybe that way.
Right across the way,
is the Mississippi River Bridge. Obviously, a boon to us here in New Orleans, and especially everybody on the West Bank. But it's preventative. It keeps some of those ships from getting to the cranes that you have to be able to unload that. What is the plan moving forward to try and create something in a more convenient area for these larger ships to enter in through the Mississippi River?
Yeah, and that, I think that's been debated for 20 plus years, what is the future of container shipping. Any product that can be put into a container, they will put in a container. Things that we never imagined being put into a container or being put in a container. It is the cheapest, safest form of shipping today. So it's vitally important that as a state, if we're going to be in the maritime business, that we're able to move goods that way. And the reality is that the vessels are getting larger. It's economy of scale, it's environmentally more friendly, and the Crescent Connection limits basically our ability to get a ship under that bridge. The other phenomena that you have is the depth of a vessel. So how deep is the river? The last couple of years, the state and the federal government was successful at getting the funding and dredging the river to 50 foot. We will complete that dredging within the next couple of months. So we've achieved the water depth that we need. Now we need the clearance of the bridge. That's why we've embarked. One is, we all know, sites have been studied for decades and debated. We've learned a tremendous amount about sites over the last 20, 30 years, about why or why not we would locate, close to the mouth of the river. Should we be West Bank, East Bank? One thing we know, we have to be on the other side of that bridge, because that bridge limits us at a 10,000 TEU vessel. A TEU is just a 20-foot container. And basically what will happen is, right now we're working vessels that are about 9,800. And that next class of ship, when the carrier says, I need to put that 10,000, 11,000 in Houston, that means New Orleans, you're out of the game. What is vitally important is you think about the opportunity, the job creation that it creates, yes, for the jobs that are related to the longshoremen, to the labor on the docks, to the trucking companies, to the warehousing, to the rail. But what's vitally important is, I equate it to, it's just like having an international airport. Is if you want to attract major companies, you better have an international airport. If you want to attract manufacturers, you want to attract retailers, you better have a container terminal. If not, guess what? Those manufacturers, even the ones you have today, they're going to Texas and they're going to Alabama. So you have to have facilities like that, because it's a quarter of their decision to locate in a state is having the transportation. Because if I'm a manufacturer, I have to have the ability to get my goods to market. And I have to have the ability to get the components to produce my good to my factory. If not, I have to go to a state that has that. And if we fail to deliver a facility, Louisiana's out of the game.
Well, Brandy, it seems like, there's no time to waste in trying to bring a facility like that to Louisiana, if that is the ultimate goal, is to try and get some of that market share from Mobile, from Houston. I know the Louisiana International Terminal, the project that we've been talking about for several months now here in New Orleans, and even in St. Bernard near Violet, is something that you all are looking at right now. Tell me a little bit about that and why you believe St. Bernard is the place for it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. There's no time to waste, but it's also got to be done right. It's something that we have studied for obviously decades. We have learned so much over such a long time in doing those studies. We've been in this business now for 50 years. Port of New Orleans is the only container port in the state, but in doing this project, we're working with the St. Bernard Port, and we're in partnership with the Port of Baton Rouge. We actually built the container on barge service, the largest network in the country, with the Port of Baton Rouge. And working together, we worked with our private partners, the carriers and the operators, in actually selecting the site. We have studied sites, and there's been this old age debate. Should you build at the mouth of the river? Should you, be closer all the way up the further inland? And, one would say, okay, absolutely true. The ocean carrier has to spend time coming up the river, steaming up the river. That costs them time and money. Well, the reality of it, a lot of things have happened since we've studied. The Port of New Orleans actually looked at the Millennium Port. This way precedes me, probably 15-something years ago. And a couple of things have happened since then. is the whole supply chain, inland distribution has completely changed. The name of the game has become just in time. It's about the inland network, is how quickly can I get from dock to warehouse to rail. So before, all ports cared about was how deep was the water, how can I get it from water onto the terminal. Now, what's more important is the terminal and the inland system. And so the ocean carrier, yes, it cost him money to come up the river, but at the end of the day, the ocean carrier is on the hook for the cost of the inland move. So he's paying for an inefficient inland move. So if you're at the mouth of the river and you don't have the infrastructure, the road and the rail, he's still paying that bill for an inefficient road and rail. So it makes no sense to build all the way at the mouth of the river where A, you don't have the road and the rail, you can't get labor there, and now I'm outside of flood protection and I've spent over $2 billion. It makes no sense. So for us, that changed everything. When you look at St. Bernard Parish, since Katrina, over $14 billion was invested in St. Bernard Parish by the federal government, and it was because of its assets of oil and gas and because of the Mississippi River. To look past that infrastructure that was invested in by the federal government, that is, like you said, we're at a time to market. To already have that kind of flood protection in place was so critically important to our partners. So I think that was fundamentally what was important. The other piece of it was that you sit kind of on the east bank where you have direct network connection to existing north and east interstates and rail systems. And really, that is where all of your distribution and manufacturers are located. And that's extremely important because that allows you to get quickly to the inland system. And if we were to have to build on the West Bank, you have less population in some of those areas. So even if you were to build additional infrastructure, you still have to come across the Crescent Connection or the Huey P. Long, which are extremely congested, and you're now going to dump all of that truck traffic onto downtown New Orleans or Clearview. And I don't know how you fix that.
Right. I think we've all driven across the bridge and been in traffic like that before.
Yeah.
Having trucks.
At the end of the day, the opportunity in St. Bernard Parish, not only because of the flood protection, but also because it's got direct connections to the New Orleans Gateway and the interstate system, a project like this can be an economic catalyst to invest in additional infrastructure in St. Bernard Parish that they've long wanted, to build another truck artery into that parish that would not only benefit, obviously, the terminal, but also for the local population, which is absolutely feasible geographically from an infrastructure standpoint, just made all the sense in the world to both us from what we've learned over the last 2 decades, but also to our partners.
So to your point, an economic boon for not just St. Bernard, the region overall, and then potentially even more infrastructure. At the same time, there are people in St. Bernard Parish who have been very vocal about this, and sometimes, and I've learned this in reporting, sometimes the most vocal may not be the most people, but they are pretty loud. So when you think about that, there's folks that say, how this could impact our roads negatively, especially with so many trucks coming in and out. This could impact the environment here, or just, for some folks, their way of life.
Absolutely.
How do you respond to those people who have pushed back against lit there in St. Bernard?
Absolutely. With any large-scale project, it's understandable that there would be concern. It's change, and it's an unknown. You would expect that, particularly at the beginning of a process. And, a project like this, we're at the very beginning of a process. We've just bought the property, over 1,100 acres, and one of our decisions to invest in that amount of property was to be able to have a footprint that not only has buffers, but to allow us to do community planning and do it in a way that we had space and room to actually work with the community to design it in a way where we weren't kind of having to shoehorn something in. If you look at our footprint uptown, I mean, it's very tight. We're on 100 acres, right in the middle of a neighborhood, next to Children's Hospital, next to houses, next to Rouse's. We never were able to master plan that. The environmental process that we're going through, it's a 3-year environmental permit that requires significant community outreach, environmental studies, noise studies, traffic studies. We're just at the beginning of that process. All those studies are done by third parties that engage the community to identify what are those issues, how do we mitigate for those issues, and until those are studied and we engage the community on those, I think that's when you can start answering the questions and start to alleviate and some of those concerns, I think, is where people start to get some understanding and some comfort of how things can be mitigated. We didn't want to wait for that to happen. Prior to applying for the permit, we actually started with the local, most adjacent neighborhood, the Violet community, and formed a community advisory committee where they selected residents from their immediate neighborhood, and then a community advisory committee in St. Bernard Parish. This is outside of the permitting process. And I think they're now just starting to get kind of their traction of working with them to identify, what are the most local concerns unique to this community. We have hired the best planners that have built terminals like this across the country. They are program managers that just built the last terminal in Savannah. And that's great. They can give us the best practices of how do you do this, the best environmental practices, how do you mitigate for the community, how do you build buffers for noise, light, traffic. But working with the community advisory committees, issues are local, concerns are local. How can we work with that community so they can uniquely tell us, here's what's more important to us, here's our ideas of what we'd like to see. If you could adjust X, then maybe we could live with this, or if you could just do this, maybe it would work better for us. And so those community advisory committees, frankly, we're learning more from them. Things that we initially thought maybe were more of a priority, they're educating us to actually, if you could just address this issue, it would work better for us. And I think the more that we've been able to start to do the studies, get information, it's really started to calm down a lot of the rhetoric, some of the fears. People really just want information. And because we're so at the beginning of a process, I think more and more, I think there's more supporters, or at least more neutral people that really just want to learn about the project. And I think there is excitement for the job creation. And when you look at this project, it is, we will be investing between the new roadway and the terminal, almost $2 billion. We'll be one of the largest landowners in St. Bernard Parish, and with our partners, probably the biggest tax base in St. Bernard Parish, and could deliver infrastructure that, that parish has wanted a third artery into St. Bernard Parish for decades, and only a project like this could deliver that.
Right. I've been heading into St. Bernard before and had bridges come up, had to go the other
Yes.
way. It's certainly something that could ease some folks there in St. Bernard. In the newsroom, we call it NIMBY. It means not in my backyard. Yep. And so I think a lot of folks sometimes will hear something new coming in and say, not in my backyard, without necessarily understanding all of the ins and outs of it, though. But that's something that you all are trying to do, because at the end of the day, as potentially one of the largest landowners in St. Bernard, it is your backyard.
Well, and I think the other point to be made is I think when you think about a project like this, particularly as a chamber and businesses, we think about the job creation and the opportunity. And I think what's important, if people don't quite realize because ports are unknown, is when you look at the Port of Houston, 85% of what goes into the Port of Houston is consumed locally. This is how we get goods onto our grocery stores. This is how Louisiana is supplied. At the end of the day, do we want to rely on Texas, who serves their population? Because at the end of the day, if we don't have a facility like this, we're going to wait to get services and supplies from Texas or Alabama. We're the last to be served. So, at the end of the day, this is how we are supplied. And if anything, we felt that during COVID. We knew what that felt like. And so it's an essential service as much of it is an economic development opportunity.
Absolutely. As you go forward, the maritime industry has a lot of promise here in Louisiana, in New Orleans, St. Bernard, and beyond down the river. With that timeline, in the future, what's the plan to ensure that these companies say, oh, well, we can't wait 3 years, we can't wait 5 years. How do we reassure those companies this is where you need to be?
I think what's extremely important is a unified vision and strategy. Both from a state level and from a maritime perspective is, I think, the Achilles heel of Louisiana has been a fragmented vision. I've often heard, I've been in New Orleans for 7 years, there has been 20 different projects, 20 different visions, and not just around the container business, but going after distribution centers is extremely important. I think that to a point, we have a collective vision. I think the state legislature, I think the governor understands the importance of the container business. The state has invested over almost $1 billion in Napoleon between the port and state funding and federal grants. We are at a tipping point. I think that we have the alignment and I think a collective vision towards building a strategy that, just like what Delta did for Memphis, is that we have the potential to be a real player in logistics, and there's no reason New Orleans Gateway cannot be a player in logistics, and we absolutely should be.
Brandy, thank you so much for being so gracious answering my questions.
Absolutely.
I think everybody would have preferred Kelsey over me, I know. But thank you so much, and good luck to everything going on down the river.
Appreciate the time. Yeah. Thank you.